Ready to go? Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming out tonight. Welcome to the evening lecture of the last First Monday's Speaker of the Year. The speaker this evening, again, is Dr. Christena Cleveland from the Reconciliation Studies Department at Bethel University in Minneapolis. She's the author of, let's see if I can do this, Disunity in Christ, Uncovering the Hidden Forces That Keep Us Apart. How'd I do on the subtitle is what always gets me. Okay, and outcoming, do you have a date yet for Priesthood of the Privileged? Okay, so sometime next year, her next book will come out, Priesthood of the Privileged. I believe we have the privilege of hearing some parts from that book this evening. Initially, I thought we were going to have to wrap this up by 9:05 because that's when the athletics open season tonight. I looked that up, but it turns out she's going to watch the Duke game and they have it on PVR. So we can go as long as we need to go. No, we will. So Christina's going to speak for about an hour, and then we'll try to have half an hour to an hour of question and answer after that. So if you've got some questions as we're going, please write them down, save them up for the end, and you'll have a time to work through those. Other than that, will you please join me in welcoming Christena Cleveland?
Hello. Okay, that's better. Thank you so much for coming out tonight on a dreary night and on a night where there are like 16 opening days in baseball and NCAA tournament. So I feel really honored that you're here. And I want to start with prayer because tonight's going to be a little bit heavier than this morning, but not necessarily in a bad way. But I just think it's good to invite God to participate in this and to take away shame and defensiveness and make us eager to be more like God. So let me pray. Holy Spirit, Savior, Father, Counselor, Comforter, Leader, Defender, Friend, Lover of my soul, we worship you. Holy Spirit, may you come and may you haunt us and challenge us and guide us and counsel us like only you can, so we can be more like you. And so we can be drawn into your plan for this world and see the beauty in that. In Jesus' name, amen. How's the sound? Can you all hear me? Is it kind of in and out, or are you okay? I feel like, sure, yeah. Okay, is that better? Down one. Hello? Is that better? Okay, is that better for you? Good, okay, I'm glad. I want you guys to be comfortable. Okay, so I'm actually going to talk a little bit about what we had talked about, kind of the second part of this morning's talk, and really talk a little bit about intergroup theory, but focus more on the end. So I'm going to zip through the four necessary elements, because when I left you earlier this morning, I kind of set up this like horrible scenario, right? It's like there are people, and you've decided that there's an us versus a them, and you've concluded that they are all the same and they don't want to talk to you and they are so different than you and they are a little bit worse than you are. And this is something that we all participate in. And I mean, that's a tough reality to face and to think about the ways that we've participated in this and the ways that we perceive others. But there is some good news. There is a solution. I wouldn't say it's the easiest thing in the world, but it certainly isn't rocket science. It's probably something that's more costly than most people want to pay, but it is absolutely possible. And what I want to propose is this intergroup contact theory. This is what we need to do if we want to break down barriers between us and them. And every time there's like a major national racial event, my assistant and I get literally hundreds of emails from people who all have wonderful intentions, and they're like, I have all these black friends and I have all these white friends, and they don't get along and they don't see eye to eye on, Trayvon Martin or Ferguson or whatever Eric Garner, whatever's happening. And so here's my brilliant idea. I want to get like my 4 most white supremacist friends to have dinner at my house with like my 4 black militant friends. And I think over dinner, over food, right? Isn't that breaking bread? Didn't Jesus say breaking bread is like the answer to everything? So why don't we just bring everyone together so we can all get along and break down these barriers and be friends? And my response is always the same. Don't do that. Someone will die, literally. Like, that is the worst idea I've ever heard. But that's usually our first go-to, right? We're like, well, let's just bring everybody together and just talk about these issues and talk about the way we perceive each other and talk about the way that we think we're a little bit better than them. And isn't honesty just the cure-all? I think honesty is a wonderful thing. I think honesty is something that has to be done under the right circumstances, though. And so intergroup contact theory is all about creating a space where we can actually have positive, meaningful intergroup interactions that actually break down these barriers, that actually lead to collaboration. And all the research shows that if you just take 2 groups of people who haven't interacted much together and put them in a room, it's more likely to go wrong than well, unless you are paying attention to these 4 essential elements. So the first one, so this is the first. Okay, so these are the 4 elements that you absolutely need for positive intergroup contact. And if you are able to successfully pull this off, and I can tell you some success stories towards the end, then you probably will see some really cool things and be surprised by what God is doing. The first one is leadership. Or in the literature, it's called institutional support. So basically, as I talked about this morning, and then we talked a little bit more about it at lunch today, everything in society is set up for us to hang out with people who are just like us. Everything in society, from the way that we categorize to the way that even our country has built interstate highways that divide entire neighborhoods along racial and class lines, even to something that came up at lunch today, which is this new crop of GPS apps that are coming out that are called the Avoid the Ghetto apps. And because there's a market for this, right? There are people who don't want to go through certain high crime areas. And so now you can buy a special GPS where you put in the address, and rather than just sending you the most direct route or the route with the least amount of traffic, they actually send you through a route so that you're not going through the ghetto because you don't want to get carjacked or something like that, right? Again, just fear and perceptions. And so in order for this intergroup contact to work, in order for people to actually come together and reverse the normal path of segregation and separation and difference, there has to be a lot of leadership in place. There needs to be a pastor if it's a church, or a college president and executive team if it's a university, and faculty or community leaders who are saying, we're going to turn this barge around. I know this is the norm, and if we stay on this track, everything will be exactly the same. So now we're actually going to be very intentional about changing this. One way that leadership leads on this is by modeling intergroup contact themselves. I was consulting with this one group that is an after-school program, and it's really diverse, and it particularly has a lot of Hmong kids and then also African-American kids. And I was talking to the president of this organization, and he's a white guy, and he was saying, we can't get any of our kids we can't get the Hmong kids and the black kids to hang out together. What should I do? And so I said, well, are you modeling any cross-cultural interactions for the kids? And he, of course, answered no, and he knew that was the first thing that he needed to reconsider in his own life. So again, this leadership is saying this is where our budget and this is where our priorities are going to be in creating this changing the norms and saying we're no longer going to be separate. The second one is a superordinate goal. Another term for superordinate is common. And so oftentimes, like I said, people want to just come together and talk about the issues. And unfortunately, that's not a great idea. But one way to get people to come together is by saying, hey, there's this goal, and we need to achieve this goal together. And so this group needs to be part of it. This other group needs to be a part of it. And we actually need to build these interdependent lines so we can be together. Now, this can be really tricky because normally we would prefer to just figure things out on our own, right? We would prefer to just set a goal and achieve it on our own. Some of the best research that's looked at this, though, has found that when you find a goal that both groups are interested in achieving, they actually start to perceive each other more accurately. Because and I've done this with churches where there's like a Hispanic church and a white church, and they've decided to work together on a community project, and both churches have capital. Both churches have connections or resources or knowledge that are unique and are needed in order to fulfill this goal. And so what happens is, rather than just perceiving people as they are all the same, or they don't want to talk to us, we actually are forced to interact with each other in ways where we acknowledge those biases and are pushing through those biases because, hey, I need you. It's not in my best interest to just label you as one of them and ignore you. Now I actually am motivated to see you for who you are and what you can offer. And that interdependence that I talked about this morning is set up. The third one, I know I'm breezing. Sorry, excuse me. The third one, I know I'm breezing through these, but we're really going to spend most of the time on the fourth one. This third one is personal interaction. It's setting up opportunities for people to get to know each other. So it's not just, okay, we're going to come and bring all that we need to bring to this superordinate goal, this common endeavor, but we're actually going to set it up so that people are maybe paired up, so they have to work together in little committees, or they have to work together on tasks. So I actually have to learn your name and your background and your relationships and what your experiences have been, and all of a sudden you become human to me because we have a personal relationship. You're not just a nameless, faceless member of this category like you were before. Now you have a story and you have a perspective, and I have to grapple with that. And there's a strong possibility that you're going to disconfirm some of the stereotypes that I might have about the group, and I'm going to have to deal with that as your partner in this. And usually this works best when it's a kind of a long-term endeavor, so not just like, oh, let's work together for Vacation Bible School, although that's a good start, because that's certainly better than what I talked about this morning, where people just come together for one event. But typically when I've seen this work well with organizations and churches, it's this kind of long-term, a year-long process or something where people are building real friendships. And the last one, and this is the one that's the hardest to talk about, but probably the most important one for these positive intergroup interactions, is equality. So the two groups need to have equality between each other. And then one of the reasons why I say this is so tricky is because then it invites this conversation about equality and inequality in the world, in the United States, here in Sioux Center, here at Dort. It brings it really home. And this is where it gets uncomfortable for a lot of people, because we live in a country where we like to believe that everything is equal and that everything is fair. And for some of us, that's been our perspective. And so I actually want to camp here on this one and talk about what it actually looks like to build these intercultural interactions, to cross cultures when there's a power difference at play. And I actually want to start by looking at Jesus. Earlier this morning, I read Philippians 2, verses 1 and 2, where Paul, again, is talking to this Philippian church where there's tons of diversity, and he's saying, be of one mind, and look to the Trinity as your example, right? The Trinity is engaged in this interdependent relationship. And now I want you to model that. So he says, be of one mind. And then he gives us some tools on exactly how to do that. So the following verses beyond that are Philippians 3 through, I think, 8. So I'll read this. Don't be selfish. Don't try to impress others. Be humble, thinking of others as better than yourselves. Don't look out only for your own interests, but take an interest in others too. Here's the clincher. You must have the same attitude that Christ Jesus had. Though he was God, he did not think of equality with God as something to cling to. Instead, he gave up his divine privileges. He took the humble position of a slave and was born as a human being. When he appeared in human form, he humbled himself in obedience to God and died a criminal's death on a cross. This passage I've spent 2 years studying, and it slays me every single time I read it, because what Paul is talking about, this is a very famous passage. This is a very famous theological concept of kenosis, this emptying that Jesus engages in. He empties himself of his divine privileges. He empties himself of his power, of his status, and he comes to earth in the incarnation to be with us. And this is a beautiful example of what it looks like to interact across power lines. This is a beautiful example of what it looks like for a powerful person to say, I want to be in relationship with someone who's less powerful than me. What does that look like? It's kenosis. It's engaging like Jesus did and giving up our power and our privileges and not clinging to them. And I look at this, and we typically look at this passage and think just about the incarnation, which is fine for the most part, because the incarnation is this mysterious, beautiful event where Jesus, who, remember, Paul has just talked about this amazing perichoresis in the Trinity, right? Where it's like the Father and the Son and the Spirit are just hanging out in perfect unity and interdependence. And 4th century church mystics talked about perichoresis as like the three members of the Trinity doing this like perpetual dance of intimacy and just having fun. It's like a party, and there's just love flowing everywhere. And Jesus is up there, and it's literally heaven, right? It's perfect love. It's perfect comfort. It's perfect inclusion. And he gives that up, that perfect life where he doesn't ever have to deal with people who betray him or pass gas or get sick and pass along their germs, right? I mean, Jesus gave all that up to come to earth. He said, I'm not going to cling to that. I'm not going to cling to those divine privileges. I'm not going to cling to my equality with God. Nobody would have faulted Jesus if he were like, earth, yeah, I'm good, right? I'll stay right here. Maybe I'll just zap them and fix everything. But I'm good because my life up here in the Trinity is perfect. No, Jesus did not cling to that equality with God. He did not hold on to that divine privilege, and he came to earth. But usually, we stop there when we're talking about kenosis. And we're like, wow, that's cool. I'm in awe, right? And, your pastor around Advent will preach a lot about this, and it'll be great, and it's inspiring. But I'm not sure it ever goes beyond inspiring. It doesn't often go to being prescriptive for us because it's so metaphysical. We're like, whoa, that's cool. But I want to talk tonight about how Jesus didn't stop engaging in kenosis when he came to earth, but rather, as he was interacting with people on earth across power lines, with people who were less powerful than him, he was constantly emptying himself of his status and his power and his privilege. And Jesus is someone that I would say had a sociological imagination. Jesus understood something about who he was. He knew that as a human being, he was located somewhere in the social spectrum, the social ladder of his time. We often think of Jesus as being oppressed and poor and down and out. And in a lot of ways, that's really accurate. Like, we know Jesus was, for example, not Roman, right? He was a member of the Palestinian Jewish people who were oppressed by the Roman Empire. And we know Jesus' family wasn't particularly wealthy because they brought 2 doves to sacrifice when Jesus went to get circumcised. And that was like the poor man's sacrifice, right? You were supposed to bring like a couple of lambs or a couple sheep. But Mary and Joseph didn't have a lot of money. So we know that in some ways, Jesus didn't have a lot of power. But in some ways, Jesus did, because Jesus' world was just as unequal as our world. And even though Jesus was not Roman, he also was not Samaritan. And as a Jewish person, he had power in his society because Jewish people had power over the Samaritans. The Samaritans were the ones that got treated like dirt. Isn't that what the Good Samaritan story is all about? Jesus is calling the Jewish people out and saying, stop oppressing them. Because Jewish people could, and they did. And so as a Jewish person, he had power in his society. As a man, he had power in his society because women did not have a voice. Women could not own property. Women were actually mostly considered property. And so he had a voice there. He had power there. He had privilege there. Jesus was free. His family owned a small business. He wasn't a slave. So he had power and privilege there. And if we look at the Bible with this hermeneutic, looking to see what is Jesus doing, how is he interacting with people who have less power than him? And how is he engaging in kenosis? How is he constantly not clinging to his privilege as a man or as a Jewish person or as a free person, but he's emptying himself so that people who have less power are given more power, so that people who have less power are affirmed, so that people who have less power and platform are given a platform and are given a voice. What does that look like? And when you do that, and I dare you to do that, and it's something I've been doing with my students, I think you'll be shocked to see what actually Jesus is doing. Because we don't think about Jesus as being cross-cultural, but he was actually the most cross-cultural person who's ever been on this earth. And so here, I think I'll just tell you a couple stories that come to mind right now. And these are like very common stories in Scripture, just to get us thinking about this before we talk about what this means for us. So one story that it's always challenging to me is when Jesus is just hanging out with his friends, and a woman who was accused of adultery is dragged in front of him. And this is essentially a lynch mob, right? There's no trial, but these people feel like they are able to, just based on the accusation that she was in adultery, they're going to stone her. All right, just think about this, right? I mean, this is an angry, self-righteous crowd. I don't think there's anything scarier than an angry, self-righteous crowd of people who think that it's their right to stone someone to death simply based on hearsay, right? A lot of biblical scholars say there's no evidence that she was actually caught in adultery. She was certainly accused of adultery, but women didn't have a voice. They didn't get a trial. So she could have been caught in adultery, could have been a rumor, who knows, right? There's some scholars who believe that the man who was supposedly in that relationship with her was part of the crowd, ready to stone her. I mean, so Jesus, if you think about it, this is a woman who has very little power in her society, in that society, right? She's being brought in front of this lynch mob to be stoned. And it's like, wait, you can't have adultery with yourself. Where's the guy, right? He's not being brought to death in this. But Jesus has power as a man. And if I were Jesus, being me, and I like to think of myself as very heroic, but I'm actually not. And so if I were in this situation, I would be like, scary, self-righteous lynch mob. I think I will go the other way. Like, good luck. I'll pray a prayer for you, but I'm going to go because this is a very dangerous situation. And that's not what Jesus does, though, right? Jesus has power. Jesus has power in a way that this woman does not have power. And what does he do? He puts himself between this lynch mob, this crazy, scary lynch mob, and this woman. And he takes all of their angry energy, which was directed at this woman, and he draws it to himself. How? By being quirky, right? He gets down and he starts writing things in the sand, and they're like, ooh, what's going on with the quirky guy over here? And so then they look at him, and all of a sudden, all eyes are on him. And now he's in the line of their rocks, right? Now, he's the one who could get killed, because now they're all paying attention. And this is not a rational crowd, right? These are people who are like looking to kill somebody today. So it could have easily killed Jesus. And then what does he say? He says, the first person who's never sinned, you get to throw the first stone. Okay. When you're talking to a self-righteous crowd full of people who want to lynch someone, do you point out their sin? Is that a great philosophy? No, right? Jesus is literally drawing all their ire away from this woman and towards himself, because he has power and he knows if there's anyone who can stop this, it's him. But it's going to come at great cost to himself, because he easily could have died that day. And I love this because he uses his power and his platform and his voice to intervene in a way that's really a foreshadowing of what happens on the cross, right? Isn't this just a small glimpse of what happens on the cross? But of course, in that case, he ends up dying. Another example of this that I think is so powerful is the woman who was bleeding for 12 years and was an outcast in society. And if you understand Jewish theology, particularly at that time, then you'll know that if someone was sick, they were seen as more sinful than everybody else. Being sick was a punishment for your sin. And so people had even more of a reason to shun her, because not only was she sick, but she was unholy. And this is a culture where holiness and washing and being clean is so important. And so here's a woman who just has been on the outskirts of society her whole life, probably completely abandoned by her biological family, probably barely living in terms of just where to live, food, and then on top of it, dealing with a life-threatening illness. This is someone whose identity has been just beat up for years and years and years, and is taught that she's nothing, just nothing. She's a threat. She's sinful. And Jesus is in this huge crowd of people, and Jairus comes along, right? And Jairus is this really powerful member of the community. Now, if you're Jesus and you're an up-and-coming minister, rabbi, revolutionary, it's in your best interest to get in good with the Jairuses, right? So you're I'll go heal Jairus' daughter, because then everyone will be ooh, he healed Jairus' daughter. And then that'll go blow up on Twitter or whatever, right? And so this is really good for Jesus' career and his ministry, his platform, to go and take care of Jairus, to prioritize Jairus, the powerful person. This is the person who has power in society. I want to make a good impression on this person. And so Jesus is on his way, because Jairus had come and said, I have a daughter who's sick. And Jesus is yeah, I'll totally go heal her. And he's on his way, and as he's walking through the crowd, and there are thousands of people there probably, this woman who's been sick, who's been on the outcasts of society, she touches Jesus and is instantly healed. And Jesus could have kept on walking, because she was already healed. He didn't need to stop. And he certainly didn't need to stop and say, who touched me? Because Jesus knew, probably, depending on what sort of theology you have about how much Jesus knew about things, but probably, right? I think Jesus knew. Was he omniscient when he was human? I don't know, right? Okay. But he stopped and he said, who touched me? Again, using his power and his platform, all eyes are on Jesus, all eyes are on Jairus, the most important two people in that space. Two men, two people who already had power and status and a voice. And Jesus says, who touched me? Diverting everyone's attention to this woman whose society's gaze doesn't ever fall on unless it's with disgust. And now all of a sudden, she's the center of attention, because Jesus is paying attention to her. And Jesus was so careful about how he diverted people's attention away from the powerful and towards the powerless. And in that moment, he healed her physically, But I'd also argue that he healed her identity, because for once, what was going on in her life was the most important thing. For once, what Jesus was doing in her life was the most important thing, not what Jesus was doing in the people who already had status and power in our society. So I think about this now, and I'm like, gosh, if Jesus came, and we have these really hard conversations with my students up at Bethel, and I'm like, if Jesus were here on earth, who would be Jairus, and who would be the woman who'd been bleeding for 12 years? Who would Jesus come talk to? And they were like, ooh, I think we're Jairus. And I'm like, yeah, I think we are Jairus. We're Westerners. And many of us are college educated. And Jesus was careful about paying attention and using his status and emptying himself, not for the people who already had some power in society, but for the people who didn't. And so we look at this passage, and we might even be inspired by what Jesus did. And oftentimes I'll have conversations with students or people that I'm talking with out in the community, and they're like, I want to be like Jesus. Like, I want to be humble. I want to do what Paul is saying. I want to be part of the solution. I want to be building bridges and thinking about what it's really going to take for me to follow in Jesus' footsteps of kenosis, of emptying myself. But usually it's this very vague humility, right? It's this like, I'm like, okay, so what's your plan? And they're like, I just need to be humble. God, just make me humble, like, and that's a good, honestly, there's earnestness there and there's good intentionality there, but this vague humility isn't going to get us very far, because Jesus wasn't vaguely humble. Jesus was strategic. Jesus knew exactly where he was located in his social spectrum, and Jesus knew exactly what he needed to empty himself of in order to ascribe dignity and worth to other people, in order to make it more equal, in order for it to be less about what he was saying and what he was doing, and more about how he could pass along that power to other people. He wasn't vaguely humble. And so if we want to engage in this kenosis, one of the things we have to do is we have to take inventory. What exactly do I need to give up? What are my divine privileges? What sort of equality do I not need to cling to? Like, what sort of status might I have in our society? Kind of like how Jesus had status in the Trinity, that I need to be like, you know what? I'm gonna give that up. I'm gonna leave that. What would it look like for us to take inventory of these things that we supposedly need to give up, if we're going to not just be vaguely humble, but strategically emptying ourselves? And for me, I'll start with myself. I have to acknowledge that my life's a little bit like Jesus, actually. In some ways, I identify with oppressed groups, right? I'm African American. I'm a woman. And I can certainly tell you some sob stories about the ways that I've been treated on Christian college campuses for being African American or a woman. It's not the focus of tonight, but I can tell you, I know what it's like to be oppressed. But on the flip side of that, I also identify with groups that have a lot of status in our society, that have power, that have a voice. For example, I get to travel all over the country and the world to speak to groups, and people like show up and they listen to me and they take notes, and I have a blog that a lot of people read, and I have a book that, first of all, someone published it, an actual publishing company, and on top of it, people read it and like take it seriously. And if there's something going on in the world, TV shows and radio shows call me up and they say, Christena, Cleveland, we want to know what you think. I have a voice in our society. People line up to hear what I have to say about things. I live in North Minneapolis, which is a low-income, predominantly black neighborhood. There are 5 people on my block, none of them who have a high school degree, who have more astute observations about what's going on in our world than I could ever have. And no one ever is calling them up and saying, hey, will you fly down to Sioux Center and speak to our group? Or, hey, will you come speak at our megachurch this Sunday? Or, hey, do you want to write a book? No one ever never wants to hear what they have to say. People want to hear what I have to say, but not them. And there's inequality in that. I have power in our society that they do not have. Now, when I talk about this, some of my friends say, well, hey, Christina, you earned it. You deserve to have more of a voice than your neighbors because they didn't go to high school. They didn't finish high school. And you have a PhD, and you worked hard for that. And, well, yeah, people read your book, but you wrote it, and you worked hard for that. And you've studied really hard, and that's why you have knowledge that people want to hear. And you've learned how to communicate, and you've practiced, and you've honed your skill. And so you deserve to have more power. You deserve to have more of a voice. You deserve for people to care more about what you think. And as much as I'd like to believe that, because it makes me feel good about myself, right? Because I'm like, yeah, all those all-nighters I pulled, yeah, I did work hard. And it's true. I have worked hard. That's true. I'm not denying that. But one thing I have to say is that I didn't quite earn everything that I have. Some things were given to me because of the circumstance in which I was born. And a recent study that I read showed that the likelihood that you that you graduate from college or not has almost nothing to do with how smart you are or even how hard you work, and almost everything to do with what family you were born into. And that was certainly the case for me. My parents are extraordinary people, and I could talk for days about them because I just adore them. But I will say this about them. There are two things that they're very passionate about. One is Jesus, and the other is education. My dad went to Yale, and his brother went to Princeton. And so they are both very education-oriented, and they both decided that they were going to raise their families in what's essentially a college boot camp. So I started studying for the SATs. You guys are probably more ACT crowd, right? But SAT is similar. I started studying for the SATs when I was in first grade. I'm not kidding. Yeah, people always laugh, and I'm like, this is no laughing matter. So we went to school every day, and we were in Spanish immersion school in the accelerated classes. So we would come, I already had to stay an extra hour after school to do special reading. But then I'd come home and I had my regular school homework, and then I would also have an hour and a half of SAT prep work that my dad would assign me. And I would do that every single day. And I didn't know I was studying for the SATs at the time, but then when I took the SATs about 12 years later, I was like, this is all remarkably familiar and very easy. And so from starting in first grade, we were doing reading comprehension exercises, we were doing analogies exercises, and this went on until I was in 10th grade, okay, through 10th grade. At the same time, my parents wanted us to be cultured. And so when I was in first grade, around the same time, they got us season tickets to the San Francisco Ballet, the San Francisco Opera, and also the San Francisco Symphony. And so 1 or 2 times a month, we would get all dressed up as a family, and we would go to the opera or something like that. So my first concert when I was in first grade was Leontine Price. Okay, yeah, a lot of people don't know who she is, but she's amazing. She's a very internationally known Black opera singer. And so most of my friends at school were going to the Michael Jackson Thriller concert, and I was at Leontine Price, okay? And then we'd have dinner afterwards and like have these conversations, like critiquing and, thinking about what we had just experienced. Another thing, when I was in third grade, my parents signed us up for Saturday Science Academy at UC Berkeley because we only lived about a 30-minute train ride from there. So I'd get up at 8 o'clock and I'd take the BART train into Berkeley, and I'd be in the science lab on campus all day till about 4 p.m. And so as a third grader, I was used to taking the BART train by myself, being on a college campus by myself, interacting, getting comfortable, like this is my future, like this, I own the place here. And my brother and I would go together And another neat thing about it was all the classes were taught by UC Berkeley undergrads who were also people of color. So we were able to see people who looked like us up front and being smart and teaching and showing us that we could be on campus just like them. So I did that for a few years, every single Saturday. And another thing my parents did, and if I ever have kids, I will absolutely do this, but they lied to us and they told us that the only thing that was open in the summer was the library. So, and I mean, we're kids, right? And we were fairly sheltered. So, I mean, it made sense to me. It's like, well, school's closed, so it makes sense that the mall's closed and the ice cream shop is closed and everything's closed except the library. And so we'd wake up in the morning and have our breakfast, and my mom would pack a lunch, and then we would walk down to the Centerville Library, and we would be there all day just reading and participating in the little enrichment activities they have at libraries, and we'd come home for dinner, and it was after dinner we got to play with our friends on the street. So that was our routine every single summer. It wasn't until I was in 6th grade that I learned that there was an amusement park 20 minutes from our house. And that's where everybody else went, right? People were at Great America having fun during the summer because we were at the library. And my dad, he went to Yale, and he really wanted us to know the Ivy League schools. And so he, at dinner, he would make us recite all 8 Ivy League schools because he wanted us to know, like, what were the names. And we had Yale everything, Yale pajamas, Yale toothbrushes, Yale sweatshirts. We had Yale blankets, Yale towels, Yale bumper stickers on our car. Everything said Yale because my dad wanted us to know that that's where he went to school and that we could go there too. And we had lots of conversations with his brother who went to Princeton. Now, when I got into Dartmouth, I tried to take credit. But even when I was in high school, I was thinking, if I go to one of these schools, it's like I fell in. Because I was Dartmouth bound. I was Ivy League bound from the moment that I was conceived because of the family that I was born into. And I forgot to mention my parents sent me to boarding school too, like one of the more prestigious boarding schools in the country so that I could be well prepared. So when I did get to Dartmouth, it was like a joke because I was like, oh my gosh, this is like child's play after my high school. So I was prepared to do well. And then I was prepared to get into a top graduate program. And I was prepared to get a fellowship to pay for it. And I was prepared. And if you look at my brother, who's going to graduate this year from Yale with a graduate degree there, and you look at my dad's brother's kids, my first cousins, my cousin Christopher just graduated from Harvard undergrad last spring, and his little brother is a sophomore at MIT, and his youngest brother is a freshman at Princeton. And you look at our family, and we're the Clevelands, right? This is what happens when you're a Cleveland. And I have to name that, and I have to say, I have status in our society. I have power in our society. I have opportunity. And I have a voice, and I have to be honest about that because there are kids in my neighborhood and some of my neighbors who are my age, who are adults now, who are every bit as hardworking, every bit as hopeful about their life dreams, every bit as desirous of the outcomes that I have. And there was nobody there to support them. And they went to schools like the school 4 blocks from my house that doesn't even have the curriculum that you need to get into a 4-year college. And there are no extracurriculars, and there are no sports. And the teachers are not supported, and there are no computers, and the textbooks are 10 years old. And that's the family that they're born into. That's the neighborhood that they're born into. And so when I look at my life and I'm tempted to think, well, hey, I earned this. I should have more of a voice. I have to say that's not exactly true. Yes, I rose to the challenge, but I had the support to do that. And there are plenty of people who not only don't have support, but they have actual impediments in their way. So that's one example of a way that I have to think, okay, if I want to take inventory, if I really want to be like Jesus and empty myself and not cling to my equality with other PhD people and not cling to my equality with other upwardly mobile people. But I actually want to empty myself of my status and take a humble position of a slave and participate in this incarnational way that Jesus demonstrates, then I have to think, gosh, what sort of status do I have in our society? And that's just one. I only named one, education. If you are college educated, you are in the 1% most educated people in the world. If you're college educated, you're in the top 30% most educated American adults. So even in America, which is already an incredibly privileged place, everyone who's at Dordt College now is going to have opportunities that many other Americans would dream of. What do you do with that? That's just one, right? Education. Let's just shout them out, and I'll repeat them so everyone can hear it. But what are some other social groups? What are some other groups of people who have power and a voice and status in our society? What? Christians. That is a great one that doesn't usually come up first on a Christian college campus. But yes, Christians. The wealthy, yeah. Oh, healthy. Oh, yeah, absolutely healthy, particularly people who have access to health care, right? Okay, healthy, I'm going to add wealthy, although wealthy simply means that you're middle class. Oftentimes we think, oh, it's the 1%. No, it's actually just, if you're just middle class, that puts you in that group of people for whom society accommodates you while alienating other people. Who else? Yeah, well, anyone who has some sort of leadership position or a platform, yep, so politicians. What are some broad social categories? Okay, athletes, if you're a good one. Males, thank you. Yes, men have power in our society that women don't have on average. White people, thank you. There's such thing as white privilege, right? The ways in which our society accommodates white people while alienating non-white people. I'll give you some examples of how that works. Who else? Yeah, people who are physically attractive, as defined by our Western Eurocentric standards of what it means to be attractive. So that excludes a whole lot of people. But yes, if you conform to that, there's a wonderful TED Talk where a Victoria's Secret model talks about how she won the genetic lottery by conforming to that ideal and how that's opened up all these doors for her that other people don't get. Okay, what else? Age, yeah. So depending on the setting, and this is one of those things where sometimes you have power, sometimes you don't. Age can be one. Yeah, probably. Yeah, extroverts. Yes. So people who are heterosexual have privilege and power in our society, right? Okay. Society accommodates people who are heterosexual and not those who are not. Who else? Yeah, so certainly, pretty much worldwide, if you're an English speaker, you have power that non-English speakers don't have, particularly here in the United States. If you don't have an accent and you're an English speaker, or you're an English speaker and you conform to, again, the Eurocentric standards of what it means to speak English, then, yeah, you have power. Still more. Keep thinking. Yeah, absolutely. If you have citizenship here in the United States. Or if you're European and you want to come here, the U.S. is like, great, welcome. Not great if you're not European. Yeah, so it's certainly wealth, just any sort of accumulated wealth. Yeah. Having a two-parent home is a huge predictor of whether you go to college and whether you'll be middle class or not. The able-bodied is one that wasn't mentioned. Mentally able is one that wasn't mentioned.
Socially able.
Okay.
What are the rules, what you should do.
Absolutely. So having some sort of cultural capital, yeah, which is really hard for, I know at Bethel, for students who don't come from a middle class white Baptist background, just navigating that. It's almost like there are all these rules that they don't even know because they've never been exposed to them. Yeah. Great. So those are just a few. Now, if you were if you identified with any of those groups that we just mentioned, this is my challenge to you, to think about, what does this mean? How does this give me a voice? How does this give me opportunity? How does this give me an in our society in ways that other people don't have? And what would that look like for me to engage in kenosis? Before I go into, before we talk about like some actual steps towards emptying ourselves, I want to talk about what I call the 3 American idols. And these are the 3 false beliefs that perpetuate inequality, right? If you're someone who is just like, wait a second, like we just named off all these people, and I identify with most of those groups, but I don't believe it, right? I mean, and that's a common response. So if you're there, I just want to invite you to keep thinking about these things. But I think that there are 3 beliefs that we like to believe are true about the United States, but they're simply not. And so if we can let go of these false beliefs, then we can start to see the ways in which we might need to empty ourselves of some of our status and our privilege and our power. And the first one is individualism. Like we like to believe that we basically operate in a bubble. And what I do as an individual is not at all affected by what's happening around me. And so, you know, if I want to go get a job somewhere, all I have to do is focus on what's going on with me, my actions, my attitude, my motivation. And what's going on in the rest of society doesn't matter at all. I think hopefully my own personal story kind of helps to debunk that a little bit. Even though I certainly was doing some things as an individual, there was a whole system around me that was supporting and propelling my movement through life in the same way that lots of kids in my neighborhood might be doing a lot of right things as individuals, but there's a whole social system around them that's preventing them from advancing through society, from racial profiling with police to the fact of the matter that black and brown kids in schools are more likely to get suspended than white kids are, often for offenses that are less egregious than the ones that white kids commit. So even just something as simple as how often I'm out of school because I'm constantly being suspended unfairly. The second one that we'd like to believe is true, but it's simply not, is equality. Like, we like to believe that everyone gets a fair shake, and everyone's always gotten a fair shake in America. Like, this is something that's so central to the foundation of our country, right? All men are created equal is what our Constitution says. Unfortunately, it doesn't include women. Women aren't mentioned at all in the Constitution, and it doesn't include indigenous people, Native Americans, and they mention black people, but as 3/5 of a person. So it's a little tricky when you have this idea that all men are created equal when it's pretty clear that that's not true. And this is something that has been with us since the founding of our country. And so when we look at equality, right, we have to wonder, is that an ideal, or is it something that's a reality? I think it's much more of an ideal, and we've tricked ourselves into thinking that it's a reality. In I teach a class on Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, which is really fun. It's going to get real fun tomorrow when we're finally done with Martin Luther King and we're getting into Malcolm X, which makes my students super nervous, which is going to be awesome. But one of the things we've been talking about is sort of the structural inequality in the United States across our history, and like who was given citizenship and who was denied citizenship based on race and based on nationality. And one of the things that we talked about recently is the massive wealth gap that exists between blacks and whites and Hispanics in our country. And the average white family has 8 times the amount of wealth as the average black family, and the average white family has 7 times the amount of wealth as the average Hispanic family. And so when you this wealth gap is not explained by savings rates, income, or education. So there seems to be something going on that helps white people just have more wealth, own more property, have a larger savings that's hurting other people. And one of the culprits, one of the reasons why this is the case is if you go back to the 50s when our federal government was giving out federal housing loans, they gave out what was at the time $2 billion worth of low interest, wonderful housing loans to basically help GIs get started. And this was sort of what funded the whole suburban boom, right? Now middle class families are able to get a home and start a nest egg and start building wealth. And so this was like our grandparents' generation, or maybe great-grandparents, depending on how old you are. And one thing that's been found is that 98% of those loans, of that $2 billion at the time, which is now over $100 billion if you account for inflation, 98% of those loans went to white people. These were government loans. So systematically, people of color were excluded from this opportunity while white people were granted this opportunity to start building a little nest egg for themselves. And then that home gets passed on from the grandparents to the parents and then eventually to the younger generation. And that is what explains a significant chunk of that wealth gap. We live in a world that's not equal. Along gender lines, an interesting study that was found that women, men, I'll start with the men. Men are hired based on their potential, on average. Women are hired based on their proven track record. And so if you're a guy and the hiring manager just kind of likes you and is like, oh, I just got a good sense about this one. He has upside. You're going to get hired right away. And you prove yourself after the fact. And they're looking for you to prove yourself, right? I mean, they're hiring you because they're expecting you to do well. But women have to already have shown, I've accomplished this and this and this and this for the exact same job. We don't live in a world that's equal. And we need to let go of that false belief. The third one is meritocracy. And this is the belief that if you just, like, we live in a world that's fair in the sense that if good things are happening to you, it's because you've earned it. Like, we live in a world that's based on merit. And if I work hard enough and I get the A and I earn it, then I deserve what I get. And basically the idea is if I just try hard enough, I will succeed. One of the most famous studies that's looked at this false belief of meritocracy is a study that was first done in 2004, but it's been replicated every year since. And last year when it was replicated, the exact same finding came out. And it was that if you have a white-sounding name and you submit your resume, you're going to be more likely to get called in for an interview than if you have a black-sounding name. And the way they did this study is they sent out over 500 resumes to major metropolitan areas. We're talking Boston, Chicago, New York, Houston, for job and responding to a job ad. And they found that they would submit the exact same resume, okay? All they did was change the name on the resume. So every time this person is qualified for the job, a solid candidate, under normal circumstances would get invited to interview. Just a solid candidate. The only thing they changed is the name. So they had two versions of a white name, male and female. Either Emily or Greg was the name. And these are names that are very commonly white. Most people assume when they see Emily that it's a white person. And then for the black-sounding names, they had Jamal and Lakeisha. It's the only thing they changed on the resume. Sent them out, and they found out that Emily and Greg were twice as likely to get called in for an interview than Jamal and Lakeisha. That study alone shatters any belief in meritocracy, because if you're Jamal or Lakeisha, it doesn't matter how hard you try, you're only going to get half as many opportunities as Emily and Greg simply because of your name. And if you go and you talk to the hiring managers, I'm sure they'd say what all people say: I'm not racist. I have a black friend, right? Which is usually what people say when they're like trying to convince you that they're not racist, right? I mean, no one's intentionally doing this, but we live in a world where there's a bias. And that bias helps propel some people, and it prevents other people from having opportunities. So we don't live in a meritocratic world. Now, one of the things that I think is easy for us to think at this point is to think, oh man. I mean, sometimes I get these emails from like people, and they're, because if I'm talking about privilege on my blog, and they're like, oh, I'm everything you're talking about. I'm white, I'm male, I'm heterosexual, I'm Christian, English is my first language, I'm attractive, like all these things. First of all, I'm like, really? Let me see your picture, because you're probably not attractive. I mean, like, what's the likelihood, that you're really all those things? But anyways, right? I mean, if you're one of those people who's thinking like, oh my gosh, she's talking about me, I want to caution you, because a really common response to that is shame. Shame for being who you are, shame for being part of the problem, or being someone that benefits from this unjust system. And I think that's something that our enemy uses to prevent us from staying engaged in this conversation, because shame makes us want to kind of slink away, and shame makes us want to not uncover who we really are. And so I think at this point, before we go into super quickly, because we're running out of time, some of the steps that I think are helpful at this point, I want to just say that every single person in here is created in the image of God. Every single person. And we're not Gnostic. I mean, at least I'm not Gnostic. You might be Gnostic. But like, that's the great thing, right? I mean, we are not disembodied souls. We serve a God who cares very much about flesh and skin, so much so that God came to earth in the flesh and in skin as a person who had a particular history and culture and ethnicity and gender and sexuality. And we were created in that same way. And so I think the challenge for each of us is to think, how do I need to take inventory? What are the things I might need to empty myself of so that I can actually participate in this kenosis, so I can actually participate in this new reality where everyone has a seat at the table, not just the white people, not just the educated people, not just the men, not just the middle class people, not just the Christians, but everyone has a seat at the table. Everyone is seen as bearing the image of God. And what does it look like for me to do that in the body that God has put me in? My dear friend Daniel is a white male pastor who can tick off most of the things on the list in terms of being privileged. And he's pastors a multi-ethnic, multi-class church in Chicago. And for him, he really had to push through the shame and get to the point where he said, how can God use my whiteness and my maleness and my educatedness and all of these things to extend the family of God? What's my role? Because everybody has a role. Everyone has a part to play, and it's going to look different for everyone, depending on what you have to give up, what your inventory is. But I want to encourage you, because this is an all hands on deck sort of thing. Like, we all want to be a part of this. Really quickly, and I hope this goes quickly, and so we have plenty of time for questions. I want to just give you, I'm going to give you three. I'm going to give you 3 tips. I'm going to cross this one off, and if you're really curious, you can come get it from me afterwards. 3 tips on how to go about this emptying, right? First, you got to do the inventory, and you're going to need to do that on your own. I'd say do it in community. I take inventory about once a month as a spiritual practice, because it's always changing. Like, my platform's changing, and my voice and my power and blah, blah, blah. And so I have a community group that I make all my decisions with, and they tell me how it is and what it's like, and I respond to their feedback. So do that. But then also, the first thing I would say is listen. once you've decided that you have something to give up, I would say listen. Some of you know who've read my book that I'm a huge baseball fan. I just love baseball. It's such a cerebral sport, and I'm a sabermetrician, and I like the stats, and I like thinking about it, and it's just so fun. So anyways, when I was in grad school, I decided I wanted to work for a Major League Baseball team, and I love the A's, but I was like, I can't work for the A's because the A's are perfect, and I don't want to know that they're not perfect. So I decided to work for the next best team, the Boston Red Sox, because at the time their GM was this guy named Theo Epstein, and he's pretty smart. He's no Billy Bean, but he's pretty smart. So I wanted to work for the Red Sox. Now, here's the thing. It's really hard to get a job with the Boston Red Sox because it's the Boston Red Sox. And but I was like, I'm going to do everything I need to do to get a job. So I decided, this was August of one year. I'm like, by next season, I'm going to be working for the Red Sox. So I got up every morning, set my timer, 15 minutes to pray just for a job with the Red Sox. Because I was like, it's not going to be because I didn't pray. So I would literally get up and I would just, and for 15 minutes, I'd be like, God, give me a job with the Red Sox. God, I bargain with you. Like, I'll do this, I'll do that. Like, I'll volunteer. Like, just give me a job. And I would just pray for 15 minutes. And then, this is when I was in grad school living in California. In December, the Major League Baseball winter meetings happen every December. It's when all the GMs and a bunch of other important people get together and they make their trades and they talk shop and blah, blah, blah. So I found out that they were going to be having the Major League Baseball winter meetings in Anaheim, which is only a 3-hour drive from where I was living. And so I said, I'm going to go down there. I talked to one of my friends who worked for the A's. I'm like, what hotel is everybody staying at? The Marriott by Disneyland. I was like, sweet. So I went down there. I had memorized like a 30-second spiel on why I'm awesome. I had like 50 copies of my resume. And I just hung out in the lobby of the Marriott at Disneyland all day on a Saturday. And just like every single person who walked by, I would just like accost them and give them my spiel and be like, you need to hire me. And I did that the whole day, and I met all sorts of people, right? I met, like, agents, I met sports writers, I met some baseball execs, I met random families who were going to Disneyland. I mean, you name it. Like, I met everybody because I wanted to, like, meet someone who worked for the Red Sox. I eventually did meet one of the VPs for the Red Sox, gave him my resume. He passed along. And then a few weeks later, I got a call from a few teams, but one of them was the Boston Red Sox saying, come on, like, you can come this season. So that's what I spent. I got a leave from grad school, and I went and I was a CEO's intern for that season. And it was really fun, and I was treated like a queen because I don't know if you know New England, but New England is really snobby in a way that the Midwest isn't. This is actually one of the things I like about the Midwest. In New England, it's all about your pedigree, where you went to school, your family, like where you work. And so I had the right answer to pretty much all of those things because I had gone to the prep schools and I had gone to Dartmouth, and now I was working for the Boston Red Sox. So I was invited to like every party on Martha's Vineyard in Nantucket, and I was getting like awesome tickets to Patriots games, and I was meeting everybody, and I had like an amazing time in Boston. Towards the end of my time there, I was hanging out with one of my friends who lives and does a lot of cross-cultural ministry in Dorchester, which is a low-income, predominantly black neighborhood in Boston. And I don't know if you know this, but Boston's like a horribly racist place, like horrible. And so I was hanging out with all these black kids from this neighborhood, and they were recounting all their stories from just that summer of ways they'd been brutalized by the police, profiled, ways they'd been like falsely arrested, just the general, like this is kind of the norm. If you talk to any black person from Boston, you're probably going to hear some of these stories. And I remember sitting there and getting kind of annoyed that they were like ruining my Boston bubble. You know, I was like, Boston's amazing. Boston loves me. Boston loves black people because clearly Boston loves me. And I think, thankfully I didn't say that. But that's what privilege says. Right? I mean, privilege doesn't want to listen. Privilege doesn't want someone to come in with a different perspective and talk about how it's hard. Privilege is like, okay, maybe talk about something hard, but make sure you leave me feeling really hopeful and awesome and excited about life. And make sure you acknowledge that I'm one of the good guys and that maybe you're talking about a problem, but I'm not really part of that problem. And that day, they were pointing their fingers at me because I was part of the problem. I benefited from this unjust system in Boston where people like them were systematically abused while people like me got treated like rock stars. And so I think the first thing is when you decide that you want to engage in kenosis, you got to zip it, even when it's uncomfortable, and when you want to defend or when you want to say, well, I'm not like that, or not all people are like that, not all white people are like that, not all men are like that, or that wasn't my reality. And if it wasn't my reality, it's not a reality. I think that's the first thing we have to stop ourselves from doing. My friend Andy says if we don't reflect, we oppress. And I think that's so true, particularly for those of us who identify with those groups that we talked about. So listening is the first one. The second one is leave your turf. Leave your turf. Jesus was so good about not just hanging out in the spaces where he was comfortable. Jesus was so good at not just making people come to him on his terms, on his turf. And I was working with this one group of women who are, and I think I read about this in my book, I'm trying to remember, they are moms who get together and pray. I think it's called Moms in Touch or something. It's this really cool group where they just get together and they pray with other moms of kids who go to the same school. And so there's the East Coast city, and there's this one school that sort of straddles an upper middle class white neighborhood and also a lower class, mostly Hispanic neighborhood. So the school's mixed, but the neighborhoods are segregated, which is pretty common in a lot of kind of urban spaces. And a lot of these white moms were going to the Moms in Touch group, and they were like, we really want to make it more diverse because we know there have to be all these Latina moms who have kids who go to the school, but we can't get them to sign up to come to our meetings and pray with us. And so they were like, can you please help us? And I said, well, what have you tried to do? And they're like, well, we sent out flyers. We put up flyers in some of the Hispanic churches. We've sent out some emails. We've pretty much gotten the word out about our group, but they just don't want to come. Can you help us? And I said, well, when does your group meet? And they said, it meets at 11 o'clock on Thursday mornings at the home of one of the white moms, right, in this nicer white neighborhood. And I was like, okay, so let's talk about this. What is it about your life that makes you available at 11 o'clock on a Thursday morning? And they were like, well, we really value time with our kids. So we've decided to make sure, with our husbands, we've decided to make sure that was a possibility. And I was like, oh, that's not the right answer, right? Because even talking about this morning, right, we like to think that we're better than them, right? And so essentially they were saying, well, we just kind of love our kids a little bit more, so we prioritized our kids. That's infrahumanization right there, okay? That's an example of infrahumanization. So I was like, yeah, that's not the right answer. And so they were like, well, we don't really know then what the answer is. And I said, that's fair. What I want you to do is go and don't call me back for 6 months. Go leave your white churches in the white suburb, wealthy area. Go to a Hispanic church on their turf, on their terms, sing their music, listen to their sermons, be friends, figure out what it is that makes you available at 11 o'clock on Thursday mornings, and maybe not some of your Latina sisters. And it's pretty funny because I challenge people to do this kind of stuff all the time, right? And usually people are like, yes, we're going to count the cost. Nope, I don't want to do that, right? I mean, that's typically the way it goes, right? This kenosis stuff is fun to talk about, but I mean, actually doing it, nobody wants to do that. So they actually did it, though, which is pretty awesome. And they called me back, and they said, and literally they called me back like 8 months later, and they said, the first thing, I feel like we have flesh on our bones for the first time, and I can never go back. And I thought, that just floored me right there. That's such a powerful statement. But then they said, so now we've been hanging out with our friends. We've learned all this stuff about these Latina women. They are awesome. They love their kids as much as we love our kids. But the thing is most of them work 3, sometimes 4 jobs. And they live they don't have private transportation, so getting around by bus is what they usually do, or walking, or carpool. And they live in a neighborhood that's not always safe at night. And they don't have access to childcare. And so there are all these barriers to why they wouldn't be able to make it at 11 o'clock on a Thursday morning. And so they said, so we decided to change it. And now they meet at 11 p.m. on a Thursday night in the home of one of the Latina moms in the Latina neighborhood. And they're doing it. They're actually being the body of Christ. But the white women who had the more money and the more resources and the private transportation and access to childcare, they had to count, they had to take inventory, and then they had to choose to give it up. And for them, that meant leaving their turf. And the last one, actually, you know what? The last one here, as I close, is cross-cultural advocacy. Tonight at dinner, we were talking about how the cross is the epicenter of cross-cultural advocacy. The cross is all about sticking your neck out for people who have problems that are nothing like your own, to the point of death. And that's what Jesus does with this kenosis. He just keeps emptying himself and emptying himself and emptying himself of his power and his privilege until he's emptied himself so much that now he's being treated like dirt, like the people that he's been emptying himself to, because he's just emptied himself of everything. And that's what our faith is about. That's what it looks like. And we just celebrated this past weekend, so it's so poignant and recent in our minds. And what does it look like to engage in cross-cultural advocacy? One really quick story. When I was in high school, like I was telling you guys, I went to this boarding school, and it's in New Hampshire, and it's really prestigious. And most of the students there, like I said this morning, were not students of color. And I think I can speak on behalf of all women. I don't normally try to speak on behalf of all women, but I think on this one issue I can. When it comes to our hair, like we take hair seriously, like Minnesotans take weather seriously, right? So like it's all about your hair. Like we're always talking about our hair. We're always getting our hair done. I was getting my hair done a few months ago, and my friend Dave, who's this white guy, called me and was like, hey, I need to talk to you. And I was like, okay, but I'm on my way to get my hair done, so I'm gonna have to call you back afterwards. And he was like, how come it seems like every time I talk to a black woman, she's either on her way to get her hair done or on her way back from getting her hair done, you know? And I was like, that's so true. But our hair is like, it's a thing, and I can't even get into it because we don't have time, but I will say, just trust me, hair is important. So if you want to get to know a black woman, start not by asking to touch her hair, but just start by trying to understand the culture around hair, okay? Because it's serious. So we're at this boarding school. It's the mid-90s. There's no internet, okay? Can you believe it, right? So you can't order hair products online. We're in New Hampshire, second whitest state in the union, okay? There's a Walgreens. No black hair products there. There's no place to get our hair done in town. All the people who have hair salons only do white hair. And when you're already different on a campus, when you already feel different because you're not rich and you're not white and you didn't come from New England like most of the other students, on top of it, having a bad hair day every single day just makes you even more uncomfortable. It makes you feel like you're even more on the outskirts of this society. So it seems like a minor thing, but it was actually a very significant thing in our lives. We didn't feel presentable. We didn't feel confident, and that affected our social relationships. It affected how we did in our class, whether we wanted to speak up in class. It was a big deal. It was something we talked about all the time. And one day, we were sitting at the Afro table, which is where all the black kids sat in the dining hall, and talking about our hair. And a woman who was a part of the community, she was a spouse of one of our faculty members, she was just happened to walk by, and she was kind of like, this is interesting. And she asked, can I sit down? And this is the white woman. And we're like, sure, you can sit down. I don't know why you care, but sure, you can listen. And she sat and she listened to us talk for 3 hours about our hair dilemmas, right? How the things I just said, it makes us feel uncomfortable, it makes us feel like we're not presentable, it makes it feel like it's just one more way that we don't fit in here. And this is a big deal. At the end of the 3 hours, she said, I don't quite understand why this is such a big deal to you, I'll be honest. I can't relate. But she said, it's clear to me that this is very important to you. So she said, I'm going to help. And we were like, okay. And again, we don't really know who this person is. She's barely, I mean, she's like a faculty spouse. So we don't really, we never really encountered her. And turns out she was one of the U.S. senators for New Hampshire. And so she had quite a bit of power, okay? She had quite a bit of power. And so things happened pretty quickly. Within a week, Walgreens was stocking like half an aisle of black hair products. And I'm pretty sure she blackmailed somebody, because we walked in and the manager was like, welcome, like, come on in, like, let me show you, like, to where, like, we got treated like royalty at that Walgreens for the rest of our time there. So I really think she, like, threatened somebody. And then she decided to apply for a grant. And then she got our school to match it. And by the next quarter, our school had purchased and fully outfitted a hair salon just for the Black and Latino students. And they fully, had all the supplies, it had everything. And they gave us a key and they said, you're in charge of cleanup, you're in charge of taking care of it. And I mean, we didn't really need a stylist, because 30 black girls, someone knows how to do hair, right? I mean, that wasn't the problem. It was just we needed a place to do hair. And when she came back and told us that news, like, we all just started crying, because for the first time we felt like we mattered. For the first time, we felt like someone was actually in our corner. And she had taken on a problem that was nothing like her own. And she had cared about a story that was nothing like her own, so much that she took it on as her own story. And she said, if this is your problem and you're part of my community, this is now my problem, and I'm going to do whatever it takes in order to make things right. And that's what cross-cultural advocacy looks like. Now, we don't often, most of us are not U.S. senators, although I'm expecting at least one of you to be one day. And so I want to show this 3-minute video that talks about what this looks like if you don't have all the power and you can't just go blackmail people, right? What can you do? And this is a video that this woman, Joy DeGruy, talks about how one white person, in a very simple but powerful way, emptied themselves of their power and their status and their privilege in order to make an unjust system, an unjust situation, right.
My sister-in-law, who's half black, half white, but looks white, blue eyes, whiter than most white folks, very white. She and I, we kind of grew up together. We raised our children together. So they're first cousins, and we, it's a wonderful, very, very multicultural family. So we're going in a Safeway one day, and Kathleen, my sister-in-law, is in front of me, and she's, writing a check for her groceries. Now, my daughter, who at the time was 10 years old, was standing with me, and I was directly behind her, getting ready to get my groceries. So Kathleen comes up, and the checker, who's a strawberry blonde,
okay, never mind. It's not even her voice, so there's clearly something wrong. Let me see if I can just connect it. This real quick. I don't know if this will work, but I don't know what happened to the guy who was here. But
very delightful.
yeah, no. Let me try one thing really quickly. Hey, do you know? Oh. Okay.
Warm, the checker, this young woman, is talking to Kathleen. Hey, how you doing? Isn't it a nice day today? They're just chatting up, and she's, yes, so Kathy writes her check, and she steps off to the side with her groceries.
Yeah.
She's writing for me. Of course, again, Kathleen looks.
It's okay when we don't really have to show it, but. Mm-hmm.
My sister-in-law, who's half black, half white, but looks white. Blue eyes, whiter than most white folks, very white. She and I, we kind of grew up together. We raised our children together. So they're first cousins, and it's a wonderful, very, very multicultural
it's not a huge
family.
deal.
So we're going in a safe way one day. And Kathleen, my sister-in-law, is in front
Okay,
of me.
you know what? It's okay.
She's,
We don't really have to use
writing
it.
acceptance
Let's just
notes.
open it. Let's
Now,
just
my
stop
daughter,
there,
who
and we
at the
can
time was
just
10
open
years
it
old,
up
was
for
standing with me, and I was
Q&A for
directly
those of you who
behind
still
her.
have time. Thanks. Oh, well, thanks.
I think because we're live casting this and videotaping this, if you can put your hands up for questions, we'll bring you a mic. I think Howard has another one, so and then if you can speak into the mic just so that people who are watching from home and when we put it up on archive, they can hear what you're asking.
Sure.
I was wondering if you could talk about some of your international experiences, especially related to equality, and how people go about kenosis internationally speaking, not just here and there.
Yeah. How do people go about kenosis in an international setting? One of the most poignant examples I can think of is Israelis who are doing a lot of advocacy work on behalf of Palestinians, which is, I know, a complex thing to even talk about, particularly in Christian settings. But long story short, and this is controversial, but this is my take on it. The West is oppressing the East, and within that sort of very difficult situation, the Israelis are granted more power by the West, and then the Palestinians even less. And so it's sort of this oppression begets oppression, and is very complex, and I'm oversimplifying. And so certainly there are Israelis who have recognized that in their culture, in Israel, they have status that Palestinians don't have, particularly citizenship and ability to go wherever they want and ability to form settlements. And so there's a lot of really interesting work that people are doing in terms of bringing up the Palestinian perspective, even amongst some of their Israeli friends, and taking some of the flack that comes along with that. Yeah. It's a great question. Thank you.
So following today's morning lecture, some of the students and I were discussing issues that kind of maybe force us into these discussions. And one of the things that was talked about was the role the media has in this entire endeavor. And we can pick on the idea of riding elephants to school, which is a story we heard about last week. And just that's a perception that media presents, right? There are hungry, dying people in Africa, and that's what all Africans are. Your map this morning of Africa, except for white Africa, is all the same. The question that we were left with was, how do we as individuals, or as a small community, or a multicultural community in a small community, make a positive change in what the media presents? And how do we speak against that? Because it seems as if all media sources, whether you're talking about right or left, have an agenda to push some sort of message across there, and how do we break through that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think just talking about it is something that doesn't typically happen. And so even just naming the biases and the stories that are out there and the takes and talking about them as a community, I think is really powerful. It's something I do a lot with my students, where oftentimes, for example, I have this picture from a Yahoo News article post-Katrina, where there are pictures of white people, and the caption says that they're scavenging. and then there are pictures of black people, and it says that they're looting. So even just pointing out those discrepancies, because those are certainly, they feed our categories, unless we're really careful about, well, they still will feed them, but they'll have less of an impact if it's conscious, if we're naming it. And then I think it's also good for us to keep in mind that we're biased too. So it's not like we can hold on to some sort of objectivity even in the midst of it.
I'll say it, you can repeat it.
I'll repeat it.
Oh, there we go. One of the things that really struck me, and we were talking about this earlier today, I think it was sort of the importance of for people who are in positions of privilege to go somewhere where you are in the minority, right? Like, I think maybe it was in your book, you told a story of sort of telling white pastors, like,
Yeah.
go to a black pastors conference and see what it feels like to be
For no
one
to
of
be
the
thinking about
minority,
you.
right? Yeah, those kinds of things. I'm just wondering. I mean, obviously, you're not familiar with Sioux Center precisely, but with the Midwest more broadly, and maybe even if you have some experience with sort of rural Midwestern scenarios like this, I mean, what are some examples you could give, sort of concretely, if someone wanted to sort of go see what this is like, what would you recommend, or something like the Black Pastors Conferences, but I mean something for college students, let's say, that would be a place for them to go and see, maybe get an experience of being in the minority.
Yeah, sometimes study abroad programs can achieve that. It really depends on the type of study abroad and who's leading it. But that can work really well. I know I took 22 white students down to northeastern Brazil, which is like the blackest part of Brazil. So it was 90% black. And that was really uncomfortable for them. So that's one possibility. I also think doing like urban summer programs as college students, so like getting involved with maybe like InterVarsity's urban project where you actually are doing a mission year. But I don't know if you've heard of Mission Year, but that's an organization that intentionally takes particularly privileged kids and challenges them to think differently. I think no matter what, it's really hard because you can always escape that. I mean, that's even like me. I've immersed myself in this really low-income community, but the fact of the matter is I can't ever fully empty myself, because if I ever get tired of my house getting broken into, or tired of the plows not the city not plowing my neighborhood, I can always just leave, and that's not the same, so. I think we have to just be really honest about that too, that we're even voluntarily being in these situations that most people don't have a choice to be in. But I've seen some study abroad work really well, so I don't know if you guys have a lot of those programs here, but that's an opportunity.
A lot of what you said was specifically addressing when you're in a privileged position. And how, when we switch the picture, what do you do when you're not a privileged person?
In what sort of scenario? Like in general, or
yeah, like some
what's
steps.
The role? What's the role of the oppressed in
exactly.
this? Right. That's a great question. Yeah. So certainly, I wrote this talk for this audience, which is all people who, in some way or another, identify as privileged. But there are certainly people here who, to a certain extent, identify as members of oppressed groups. So I think reconciliation, which is essentially what we're talking about today, is incredibly costly, which makes sense because reconciliation is all about the cross, right? And the cross was costly and painful and bloody and horrible and like R-rated, right? So I think it costs everyone something. We talked a little bit about what it might look like for privileged people. For oppressed people, I think the cost is forgiveness. And I think the cost is hope. And I think I've been reading a book that I think is really good on this topic. It's Miroslav Volf's book. Miroslav Volf is a theologian who's written a lot about reconciliation. And he is, I hope I don't butcher this, and this is being recorded and everything, and he'll probably tweet me and be mad. I can't remember exactly what country he's from. It's in Eastern Europe. And he was detained for 6 months and interrogated as part of the like post-communist Civil War kind of deal that his country went through. And I think in his book, which is called The End of Memory, he talks a lot about what it means to forgive and remember rightly, even when horrible things happen to you. And this was like very psychologically, I mean, it was torture. It wasn't physically torture. It wasn't physical torture, but it was psychological torture. And he was detained from his family for 6 months and just pummeled with all these questions. And so he really challenges oppressed people to even remember events like that in ways that are consistent with this reconciliation theology, where he was saying that man, this one man in particular who was an army officer who interrogated him for 6 months and has caused all this post-traumatic stress in his life, he said, I have to remember him as someone who bears the image of God first. And as someone who, like I said, can tell you some sob stories, it is really costly to get to that point, to have that attitude towards people while also maintaining this, holding on to the reality of the injustice, right? It's hard to be in that tension, and I think that's what it costs oppressed people. I think most of the action, the like physical action, should be privileged people. I think it's, if you look at the model of the incarnation, it's privileged people going, it's privileged people giving up. But I think that oppressed people, in order for this really to work, have to be receptive and willing to forgive and move forward.
I think we have time for one more question, if there's one more down here.
Hello. What advice do you have for those who weren't born into power, as far as I guess how to gain power and a voice?
Mm-hmm. Do you mean in America, or just like, I mean, are we talking like, because I mean, I would argue that everyone who's American has power. Mm-hmm. So are you talking about someone who, like, born in a slum in somewhere in Nairobi or in, yeah, like what's their role in reconciliation? Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is in your individual context, thinking about what's the social structure here? Because I think even there's pecking orders within pecking orders, which is kind of what I was alluding to with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, right? I mean, and so I think it's going to be hard to find someone who's at the absolute bottom. So no one can really fully play the, like, I'm 100% oppressed. I mean, some people can maybe, but it's pretty hard. And so for that particular person, I think Mitri Rahib, who's this like Palestinian theologian, is really instructive to me on that point, because he says that, and he's someone who's Palestinian who could probably identify in a lot of ways almost entirely as a member of an oppressed group. And he says that the challenge for people who have been victimized is not just grasping hold of the cross and like basically just identifying as victims, because he said that completely ignores the resurrection. And he said lots of people who are Christian, who are oppressed, don't think at all about the reality of the resurrection, which is just as true as the reality of the cross. And so I think that's his challenge to people who only identify as oppressed, is if that's all you identify with, then where's your eschatological hope? Like what hope are you holding on to that's actually going to empower you to take on these systems? And he kind of reminded me when I was there of, so Jesus talks about, this is why I just wish I were there when Jesus was talking about these things, because when Jesus was talking about the faith the size of a mustard seed that can go and move that mountain, we always translate it and think about it as, I can move mountains if I have the faith the size of a mustard seed. Jesus was facing and pointing to a very particular mountain. It's called Herodian, and it's still there outside Jerusalem. And this was a mountain that Herod, it's man-made. He created it for himself, kind of like as like an altar to himself, or as like to show his dominance. And so Jesus was really, he was saying, if you have the faith of a mustard, the size of a mustard seed, you can move that mountain being a symbol of oppression, the oppression of empire. And so Mitri Rahib is really passionate about saying we have to hold on to the faith of that comes from this power and the resurrection, or else we'll never be able to take on the systems that are oppressing us. And that's hard. It's hard to hear, but I think it's true.
Thanks.
Sure.
Jeremy, thank you.
Thank
Christena
you,
Cleveland.
everyone. R-A-H-E-B. Yeah. B, as in boy. Rahib.
Oh, I almost had it right.